Why medieval women's lives were cruel. This is not a fairy tale about beautiful ladies in towers and knights on white horses. This is a reality in which women had to survive. The Middle Ages are a time when being born a girl already meant fewer rights, more responsibilities, and a constant struggle for a place in the sun. Why was the life of medieval women cruel? Today we will look into it without embellishment. Hard work, early marriages, lack of choice, lack of voice. Diseases, unassisted childbirth, accusations of witchcraft, life in the shadow of men. All this was not an exception but the norm. Get ready for a story in which there are no heroines and happy endings, only everyday life, only the harsh truth. The lives of women in the Middle Ages were strictly defined by their position in society and the expectations imposed by religion, culture, and custom. From birth, a girl was considered someone else's property, first that of her family, then of her husband, to whom she could be betrothed at an early age. Childhood was short, and education, if it happened at all, was limited to housekeeping, obedience, prayer, and needlework. Education was not encouraged, especially if it went beyond reading religious texts. In villages, women worked alongside men, in the fields, stables, and mills. However, their labor was seen as a natural duty rather than a contribution. It was unpaid and not socially recognized. Instead, a woman was valued for her ability to bear and raise children, especially sons. Pregnancy was frequent, sometimes annual. Contraceptive methods were unknown or banned by the church. Every pregnancy carried a risk of death, as medical care was primitive and midwives often relied on superstitions and spells. Women of noble families suffered in their own way. Their freedom was confined to the walls of castles and monasteries. They were taught to be modest, to avoid eye contact with men, and to accept marriage as a political alliance. They did not choose their husbands. Their opinions were not considered. Many were sent to convents against their will. Even there, discipline was strict. Long prayers, fasting, physical labor, and constant submission to the abbess. The lack of personal freedom was felt everywhere. In towns, women participated in crafts. They could be bakers, weavers, laundresses, but were not admitted to guilds. The law did not protect their interests. If a husband died, a woman could inherit his business, but often lost everything due to legal restrictions. Women could not testify in court on equal footing with men. Their words were not considered reliable. In cases of crimes against them, punishment for the perpetrator was often mild or non-existent. Punishments for moral transgressions were especially brutal. Women were beaten for adultery, extramarital pregnancy, or violating dress codes. Some were forced to wear shame masks, others were publicly whipped. Suspected witches were burned at the stake. Suspicion could arise from potions, herbal knowledge, solitary lifestyles, or simply envy from neighbors. Inquisition trials were rarely based on evidence, more often on denunciations. Physical labor was accompanied by constant fatigue and injuries. Cleaning, sewing, washing clothes in cold water, cooking over open flames, and caring for children all happened simultaneously. Pain was not a reason for rest. Rest was a luxury. Many died in their 30s or 40s. Old age was rare. If women lived to old age, they were mocked or feared. They were considered dangerous, as life knowledge and experience were equated with witchcraft. Hygiene conditions were appalling. Menstruation was seen as filth, shame, a reason for isolation. There were no hygiene products. Women used rags, moss, ashes. Bathing was once a month at best if water was available. Diseases spread quickly. Women suffered from hypothermia, infections, syphilis, parasites. Medical help was available only to the wealthy, and even then not always effective. The poor had no choice. All they could do was pray and endure. The family was not a place of comfort. A husband could beat his wife, and this was considered acceptable. The law allowed punishment if a woman disobeyed. There was nowhere to run. Divorce was impossible. Shelters did not exist. Parents would not take her back. The church taught patience and submission. Any complaint was seen as a sin. A woman was expected to suffer in silence and accept pain as a path to saving her soul. Even motherhood did not always bring joy. High child mortality, disease, hunger, and war took away infants and teenagers. A woman might bury 3 children in a year. Crying was part of daily life. Instead of toys, straw dolls. Instead of a cradle, a wooden box. Instead of holidays, funeral processions. Loss was seen as fate, inevitable, and no one questioned why everything was so unjust. The structure of medieval society ensured that women remained at the bottom of every hierarchy. Power was concentrated among landowners, clergy, and kings, positions that women could not occupy. Even within the family, the male head dictated all decisions. Women had no legal personhood of their own. Their identities were shaped by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, or widows. Every action was measured against male authority, and deviation invited punishment or social ostracism. Marriage was a contract arranged by families, often without the woman's knowledge or consent. Love was irrelevant. Property was at stake. Daughters were exchanged for land, alliances, or livestock. Dowries had to be paid, and failure to provide one lowered a girl's chances of being married at all. Unmarried women were seen as burdens. In many towns, widows and spinsters were legally restricted in their freedom to move, work, or speak publicly. Religious teachings reinforced gender inequality. The church depicted women as morally weaker, descendants of Eve's original sin. Female silence and obedience were praised as virtues. Nuns, though spared from marriage, endured isolation, asceticism, and often psychological torment. Their days were filled with labor, fasting, strict rituals, and submission to male clergy. Even visions or spiritual insight had to be verified and approved by men. Female mysticism was often labeled as heresy. The concept of honor was tied to a woman's body. Virginity was her only real asset before marriage. Afterward, fidelity defined her social worth. Any suspicion of impropriety could lead to shaming, mutilation, or worse. Men, meanwhile, faced no comparable scrutiny. The double standard was entrenched and accepted as divine order. Even rape victims were blamed for tempting men. They could be forced to marry their attacker to preserve family honor. Daily life revolved around endless labor. In peasant households, women were responsible for grinding grain, baking bread, tending animals, fetching water, spinning wool, making clothes, raising children, and caring for the sick. There was no division between work and home. It was all the same. Everything was handmade from food to bedding. Tools were crude. Time was governed by seasons and daylight. Breaks were rare. Sleep was short, and rest was guilt-ridden. Urban life offered no respite. Female servants worked in other households for meager pay and no security. They were vulnerable to exploitation, harassment, and dismissal without cause. Female artisans faced stiff barriers to joining guilds or owning workshops. Widows might inherit a business, but only until a male heir could take over. Women could sell goods in markets, but were taxed and fined more often than men. Public space was policed for female behavior. The medical understanding of the female body was limited and often harmful. Women were thought to be governed by their wombs and humors. Hysteria, melancholy, and infertility were diagnosed with ignorance and treated with superstition. Midwives had practical knowledge, but were distrusted by male doctors and persecuted if birth went wrong. Natural processes like menstruation or menopause were seen as disorders or omens. Many women suffered in silence, without names for their pain. Childbirth was the most dangerous moment in a woman's life. Mortality rates were high. There were no antiseptics, no trained surgeons, no blood transfusions. Difficult births could result in death for the mother, the child, or both. Infection was common. Recovery was slow, if possible at all. Postpartum depression was misunderstood and unacknowledged. Women were expected to resume work immediately, regardless of physical or emotional condition. Gratitude was demanded, not sympathy. Natural disasters and famines disproportionately affected women. During scarcity, men ate first. Women rationed food or went without. Malnutrition weakened their bodies further. War added another layer of suffering. Armies pillaged villages, raped women, and left destruction in their wake. Women bore the burden of rebuilding homes, burying the dead, and feeding survivors. They had no political voice to protest the wars. They were casualties in silence. Social mobility was rare. Talented or intelligent women had few avenues to express themselves. Writers, painters, healers, and philosophers existed, but were often erased or their work attributed to men. Their stories were not written down. Their discoveries were dismissed. History recorded kings and bishops, not the weavers or midwives. Recognition was denied not because they lacked skill, but because the world refused to see them. The centuries passed with little change. From one generation to the next, girls inherited the same fate as their mothers, a life of toil, silence, obedience, and sacrifice. Few questioned it because questioning brought danger. The brutality was normalized. Survival was a victory. Hope, if it existed at all, was found not in the present, but in prayer for the afterlife. Life itself was considered a trial, and for women, that trial had no end. The expectations placed on medieval women were rigid and relentless. From sunrise to sunset, their lives were governed by routine and repetition. In rural areas, the rooster's crow signaled the start of a long day. Women rose before dawn to stoke fires, prepare meals, and begin chores. There was no concept of leisure, no pause between tasks. Time was not their own. It belonged to the household, the land, the church, and the demands of survival. Seasonal work dictated the rhythm of life. In spring and summer, women planted and harvested. In fall, they preserved food, repaired clothing, and stored provisions. Winter brought cold, hunger, and illness. Each season carried burdens. Farming was not a male activity alone. Women tilled soil, weeded crops, gathered wood, milked animals, and carried water over long distances. Tools were heavy, conditions were harsh. There were no gloves, no protection from weather, and no alternative. Their contribution was vital, yet unrecognized. Men controlled property, made decisions, and received credit for household success. Women remained unnamed. In records, they were often listed only as wife of or daughter of. No surnames of their own, no deeds in their names. If they inherited land, it was quickly transferred to a male relative or absorbed through marriage. The law saw them as dependents, incapable of autonomy. Religious festivals and holy days punctuated the calendar but rarely brought rest. They meant additional obligations, cleaning the home, preparing special meals, weaving offerings, and attending Mass. The church was both a source of solace and oppression. It preached humility, sacrifice, and the virtue of suffering. Women were told their place was beneath men, as caretakers and vessels of morality. Their pain was portrayed as sacred, their silence as noble. Punishments for women were uniquely designed to humiliate. While men might face prison or fines, women endured public shaming. The pillory, ducking stool, and scold's bridle were instruments of social control. Accusations required little proof. A sharp tongue, loud laughter, or defying a husband could result in punishment. Town squares became theaters of degradation. Spectators jeered while women were bound and displayed. It was a method of fear and conformity, enforced by custom and law. Motherhood did not shield women from brutality. In fact, it increased their vulnerability. The pressure to bear children, especially sons, was constant. A woman who could not conceive faced ridicule or abandonment. If a child died, the mother bore the blame. If many children died, as often happened, the suspicion grew. Grief had to be hidden. Mourning too long was seen as weakness. Life required resilience, not sentiment. Widowhood offered a brief glimpse of independence, but it came with danger. A widowed woman could manage her deceased husband's estate, but only temporarily. If she had no sons, her rights were contested. She could be forced into remarriage or accused of wrongdoing to strip her of assets. Widows were also targets of harassment, especially if they lived alone. Solitude was treated with suspicion. Many were accused of witchcraft or immorality. Witch hunts, though more prevalent in later centuries, had medieval roots. Herbalists, midwives, or simply women with knowledge outside the norm were vulnerable. Miscarriages, bad harvests, or unexplained illness could be blamed on a woman's supposed alliance with evil forces. Trials were not based on logic. Torture extracted confessions. Executions were carried out without hesitation. A woman's reputation was fragile. A single rumor could end her life. Even within the home, safety was not guaranteed. Domestic violence was common and tolerated. The concept of marital rape did not exist. A husband's authority was near absolute. Women endured beatings, emotional abuse, and threats with no legal recourse. Neighbors often ignored the signs. The church encouraged reconciliation, not justice. Suffering in marriage was seen as part of a woman's spiritual journey. Escape was rarely possible. In the rare cases when women formed supportive communities, such as convents, informal sisterhoods, or working partnerships, they found brief moments of shared purpose. But these arrangements were fragile and often interrupted by external forces: war, plague, or religious reform. Bonds were broken. Support was dissolved. The individual returned to isolation. Relationships could not replace systemic oppression. The world moved forward slowly. Centuries passed, but the pattern repeated. Girls grew into women and inherited the same limitations, the same expectations, the same burdens. They adjusted, coped, and survived. There was no revolution for them, no mass awakening, just small acts of endurance: a loaf of bread baked, a child rocked to sleep, a field planted, a wound treated in silence. These were their rebellions, quiet, unseen, and forgotten. In many parts of medieval society, a woman's world was confined to a narrow sphere. The boundaries were set not by walls, but by expectation. Travel was limited, particularly for women of lower status. Roads were dangerous, patrolled by bandits or soldiers, and women rarely journeyed without male accompaniment. Even in towns, moving from one district to another could invite scrutiny. Unaccompanied women were considered suspicious. Respectable women stayed home. The street belonged to men. For those who worked outside the home, options were scarce. Some women served in noble households as maids or laundresses, cleaning chamber pots and scrubbing floors from dawn until night. Others worked as alewives, spinning and brewing small batches of beer, until laws and guilds pushed them out of the market. Female weavers were common, yet the profits were claimed by men who owned the looms. Market stalls, if permitted, brought in only pennies. Competition was fierce, and success was temporary. Prostitution existed as both necessity and stigma. Some women turned to it in desperation, abandoned by husbands, orphaned, or simply too poor to survive otherwise. Cities attempted to regulate the practice, building brothels and taxing earnings. The women were publicly shamed, subject to violence, and excluded from religious life. Redemption was rare. A woman once labeled fallen remained an outcast, no matter her intentions or circumstances. Sanitation was minimal. Water sources were often shared by humans and animals. Women fetched water daily in heavy buckets, walking long distances over uneven ground. Bathing was infrequent. Soap was expensive. Lice and fleas were part of everyday life. Toilets were crude or non-existent. Waste was dumped into streets or streams. Disease flourished. Women caring for sick family members caught illnesses quickly, often without understanding the source. Plagues could erase entire households within days. The food supply was unreliable. Harvests failed frequently due to weather, insects, or war. During shortages, women were expected to make do. They stretched flour with ground acorns or sawdust. They boiled roots and nettles. Mothers often gave their portions to their children, enduring days with little or no food. Malnutrition weakened bones, teeth, and immune systems. Hunger was not a passing discomfort. It was a permanent state for many. Illnesses were feared and misunderstood. Superstition explained what medicine could not. Women applied poultices, whispered prayers, burned herbs. Midwives did what they could during difficult births, using only their hands and whatever tools they had. Fevers were common. Sores, infections, and mysterious swellings plagued the body. Pain was constant and rarely relieved. There was no anesthetic, no antibiotics. When women cried out, they were told to pray harder or accept their suffering as divine will. Education was rare. Boys, if fortunate, learned to read and write through religious institutions or private tutors. Girls were taught only the essentials for managing a household, if they were taught anything at all. Some learned to read the Bible, but few were permitted to study philosophy, history, or law. Intellectual curiosity in a woman was seen as improper or even dangerous. Books were handwritten and expensive. Libraries were locked behind monastery gates. Art and music were limited to the upper classes. A noble woman might learn embroidery, the lute, or basic Latin hymns, but these skills were ornamental. Creativity outside approved boundaries was discouraged. Poems written by women were rarely preserved. Paintings, if signed at all, were attributed to men. Women's experiences and emotions were not recorded. They became invisible, even to posterity. What they felt, thought, and suffered remained unwritten. Social order depended on their silence. A woman who spoke too much, asked questions, or defied instruction was considered unruly. The term scold was used to label women who challenged male authority. Legal codes punished them. Devices like the scold's bridle, a metal cage worn over the head with a plate inserted into the mouth, were used to enforce silence. The goal was not just control, but humiliation. A quiet woman was a good woman, and so they remained quiet. Generations passed in hushed repetition. Grandmothers taught granddaughters how to endure. Songs were sung softly at night, stories whispered by the fire, traditions passed without protest. Survival depended on compliance. To question too much was to invite punishment or exclusion. To resist openly was to risk death. Conformity was not a choice. It was a requirement of existence. The medieval home, far from being a place of comfort, often served as another site of labor and oppression for women. Most homes were poorly constructed, made of wood, mud, or stone, with a central hearth and little ventilation. Smoke from the fire filled the room, stinging eyes and blackening walls. Women cooked over open flames, risking burns and breathing in fumes day after day. There were no chimneys, no insulation, and little furniture beyond benches, a table, and straw-stuffed bedding. Cleanliness was difficult to maintain. Dirt floors were swept with branches. Rats and insects were constant companions. Food storage was rudimentary. Mold and spoilage were common. Women had to inspect and sort through everything: grains, meat, vegetables, hoping to salvage enough to feed the family. Preservation methods were crude: drying, salting, or storing underground. Spoiled food still had to be eaten in times of scarcity. Illness from poor nutrition or contamination was inevitable. The burden of childcare fell entirely on women, often without assistance. Infants had to be nursed for years due to the lack of safe alternatives. Diapers did not exist. Cloth strips were used and washed by hand, usually in cold water. Children had to be watched constantly to prevent injury, illness, or wandering into danger. Mothers labored while carrying babies on their backs, or tied them to cradles with cloth straps while they worked nearby. As children grew, the responsibilities of girls quickly shifted to mimic their mothers. They helped grind flour, sew clothing, clean the home, and watch younger siblings. There was no protected childhood. Play was rare and brief. Daughters were reminded daily that their future was one of service, not dreams. Toys were handmade, if they existed at all. Simple carved dolls, cloth animals, or stones arranged in games. Imagination provided the only escape. Women were expected to serve not only their families, but also their broader communities. They tended the sick, delivered babies, prepared bodies for burial, and performed rituals during holy days. These tasks were unpaid and often thankless. The death of a neighbor's child, the suffering of an elderly parent, or the slow decline of a leprous relative became part of their daily lives. The village relied on them, yet offered no safety net in return. Old age brought no honor. As a woman aged, her body weakened from decades of physical labor, repeated childbirth, and untreated illness. Her usefulness diminished in the eyes of others. Wrinkles, gray hair, or blindness marked her as past her value. She might be mocked or feared, called a witch or burden. Widows with no sons were particularly vulnerable. They were often driven from homes or sent to live in poorhouses, crowded, cold, and unsanitary. Clothing was simple and functional. Most women wore coarse wool or linen tunics, covered with aprons or cloaks. Undergarments were minimal. Dye was expensive, so colors were dull. Women often made their own garments, spinning yarn, weaving fabric, and sewing by hand. This process took weeks. Footwear was rare or reused until worn through. Washing clothing was laborious, involving soaking, scrubbing with ash soap, and drying in the sun or near the hearth. Ceremony and celebration, when they occurred, offered brief relief. Weddings, harvest feasts, or saints' days brought gatherings, dancing, or shared meals. But women still worked during these events, preparing food, cleaning after guests, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Even during childbirth or mourning, their duties did not cease. Rituals were important, but so were appearances. A woman had to maintain respectability, even while grieving or in pain. Rules about modesty and behavior were strictly enforced. A woman who showed too much skin, laughed too loudly, or looked a man in the eye for too long could be punished. These expectations were not just social, they were legal. Courts heard cases of unwomanly conduct and issued fines or worse. Accusations could come from neighbors, relatives, or even jealous wives. Gossip was dangerous. One careless word could ruin a woman's standing permanently. For most, escape was unthinkable. Cities offered no refuge, and the countryside held no secrets. Travel required money, which women rarely controlled. Disguising oneself as a man risked execution. Fleeing to a convent required approval. Running away from home brought shame and excommunication. The systems in place were designed to ensure obedience. They functioned not through violence alone, but through structure. Layered expectations that left no space for refusal. The role of religion in the daily lives of medieval women was immense and inescapable. From childhood, they were taught that their suffering had spiritual value. Pain, hardship, and obedience were not only expected, they were exalted. The church, acting as both guide and gatekeeper, reinforced ideals of female humility, chastity, and submission. Women were encouraged to model themselves after saints who had endured silence, martyrdom, and asceticism. Church services were conducted in Latin, a language most women could not understand. Priests were always male, positioned as intermediaries between God and the people. Women sat or stood separately in churches, often in the back or behind partitions. They were not permitted to read from scripture aloud, interpret religious texts, or hold positions of authority. Even nuns, devoted to religious life, remained subordinate to male bishops and abbots. Religious instruction emphasized the sins of women. Original sin was blamed on Eve. Lust was considered a uniquely female weakness. Women were held responsible for male temptation, and their bodies were described as inherently impure. Modesty was preached in every sermon. Any deviation from dress, voice, or posture was labeled immoral. This ideological framework shaped laws, customs, and interpersonal relationships, permeating every corner of life. Confession was one of the few religious practices open to women, yet it offered no safety. Priests often asked invasive questions, especially regarding sexuality. A woman who admitted to desire or who was accused by others might be subjected to penance, public shame, or exclusion from communion. Private matters were made public. Reputation was everything. A single mistake or rumor of a mistake could end a woman's social standing. Religious holidays imposed additional burdens. While the calendar marked dozens of saint days, fasts, and holy observances, each came with work. Women were responsible for preparing candles, cleaning churches, weaving special garments, and organizing food. Participation was mandatory regardless of personal belief or physical exhaustion. Those who missed Mass were fined or punished. Faith was not optional, it was expected, policed, and ritualized. Pilgrimage was one of the few forms of travel permitted to women, but it was arduous and risky. Women walked for weeks or months, often barefoot or in poor footwear. They slept in crowded inns or by the roadside, vulnerable to theft and assault. The journey was physically punishing and spiritually uncertain. There was no guarantee of healing or absolution at the end, only more walking, more prayer, and the long journey back. For some, joining a convent was the only alternative to marriage. Girls as young as 7 were given to the church by their families. Convents provided food, shelter, and education, but also isolation, surveillance, and obedience. Days were filled with prayer, silence, and labor. Contact with the outside world was restricted. Letters were censored, visits were rare. The cloister became a lifelong sentence for those who entered without choice. Religious visions or mystical experiences, if claimed by women, were met with skepticism. Approval from male authorities was required. Some women gained brief fame as visionaries, only to be silenced later when their words challenged the status quo. Others were accused of heresy, imprisoned, or executed. The line between sanctity and blasphemy was drawn by those in power. A woman's insight was only valued if it confirmed what men had already said. Religious charity, though widespread, did little to ease the suffering of most women. Alms were distributed sporadically and selectively. Widows might receive bread during feasts. Orphans could be taken in by monasteries, but only if space allowed. The sick were treated by nuns using rudimentary herbal knowledge, but resources were scarce. The church collected tithes from everyone, including the poorest, but rarely redistributed wealth in a meaningful way. Death was interpreted through religious doctrine. Women were buried with little ceremony unless they belonged to noble families or religious orders. Headstones were simple or absent altogether. Most graves were unmarked. A woman's soul was believed to face judgment based on obedience, chastity, and suffering. Her earthly life was not expected to bring happiness. Instead, she was taught to hope for eternal peace, a distant reward after a life of hardship. Religious doctrine and social structure worked together to ensure that women never expected more. Their roles were justified as divine, their pain sanctified, and their silence praised. The system was not enforced by chains but by belief, and those beliefs were passed from mother to daughter, reinforced in prayers and stories, until they became indistinguishable from truth. The result was not just control, but resignation, deep, generational, and complete. The medieval economy, rigid and stratified, left women with few avenues for independence. Land, tools, livestock, and legal contracts were controlled almost exclusively by men. Even in rural households where women contributed significantly to agriculture and domestic production, they were not viewed as economic agents in their own right. Their labor was invisible in legal records, unacknowledged in taxes, and unprotected by rights. Crafts and trades were typically inherited and passed through male lines. Guilds, the official organizations that governed quality, pricing, and training, excluded most women. A few exceptions existed in textile-related trades or food markets, but even there, women were supervised by male relatives or restricted to assisting roles. Their work had to be conducted quietly, modestly, and without ambition. Aspiration, if expressed, was discouraged. Ambition was not seen as appropriate in women. In towns, widows were sometimes allowed to run their late husband's shops, but only temporarily. The expectation was that a male relative would eventually take over, or that the widow would remarry. If she did not, pressure mounted from neighbors, local authorities, and guilds. Many were accused of cheating customers or mismanaging stock simply for staying in business too long. Economic independence was tolerated only as a short-term necessity, never as a goal. Women who attempted to generate income from their own skills faced other challenges. Lace making, spinning, baking, brewing, and laundering were all time-consuming, physically demanding, and poorly compensated. Payment was often delayed or denied altogether. Male customers took advantage of women's limited recourse to legal protection. If a woman took a case to court, her testimony carried less weight, and her presence there was questioned as immodest or improper. Debt was a constant risk. Many women borrowed small sums to buy food or materials, only to fall further into poverty when illness, poor harvests, or family emergencies struck. Imprisonment for debt was common, even for minor sums. Debtors' prisons were filthy, overcrowded, and unsupervised. Women locked inside often had children with them. There was little to no medical care. Death was frequent. Release required outside help, which many lacked. Housing was unstable for the poor. A woman's home depended on her father's, husband's, or master's status. If any of them died or abandoned her, she could be left without shelter. Squatting was illegal. Charity homes were overcrowded or inaccessible. A woman alone was assumed to be a beggar or a prostitute. Respectable women did not live unaccompanied, and landlords were hesitant to rent to them. Homelessness meant exposure to weather, assault, and disease. Taxes and fees were levied without consideration for a woman's ability to pay. Market tolls, church tithes, and royal levies applied to everyone, yet women earned less and owned less. Refusal or inability to pay could result in fines, confiscation, or forced labor. There was no safety net. Hunger and hardship were accepted as the natural consequences of a woman's position in society, not as problems to be addressed or solved. Even in noble households, women's access to money was limited. Their dowries were absorbed into their husbands' estates. Their jewelry and clothing, though expensive, were symbols of family wealth, not personal property. A noble woman might manage her household budget, but her authority ended there. If her husband died and she was not named regent or guardian, her rights could be stripped by in-laws, the crown, or the church. When women gave birth, they faced added costs: midwives, herbal remedies, linens, and funeral expenses if things went wrong. These were paid from household funds controlled by men. A woman in labor had to hope that the family could afford help and that she would not be blamed for any misfortune. If a baby died, it was viewed as a spiritual failing. If a mother died, the household moved on without ceremony. There were no unions, no advocates, no institutions defending women's economic rights. They were expected to be content with survival. Success was measured by endurance, not advancement. To ask for more was to challenge the very order of things. As generations passed, these limitations became tradition, then law, then unquestioned truth. Poverty was not seen as a result of injustice, it was seen as a woman's lot in life. The economy moved around them, and sometimes through them, but never for them. They carried burdens, made sacrifices, and performed labor without credit or compensation. And when they died, their absence was felt briefly, then forgotten. The economic system, like every other structure in the medieval world, was not built for their benefit, but they were expected to uphold it just the same. Law and justice in the medieval world offered little protection to women. The legal framework reflected the values of a society that prioritized hierarchy, property, and male authority. Women were rarely seen as full legal persons. They could not vote in town councils, hold office, or serve as judges. Most legal contracts had to be signed or approved by a male guardian, father, husband, or son. Autonomy was viewed as an exception rather than a right. Crimes committed against women were inconsistently prosecuted. Assaults, rapes, and thefts went unreported, not because they didn't occur, but because women had little faith in the system. Trials required witnesses, usually male. In many cases, a woman's testimony alone was not enough to secure a conviction. When cases were heard, the burden of proof often fell on the victim. She had to demonstrate her innocence, her virtue, her modesty. The attacker's status and reputation frequently carried more weight than the harm done. If a woman accused a man of a serious crime, she risked retaliation. She might be countersued for defamation or shunned by her community. Neighbors could stop doing business with her. Her children might be mocked or excluded. Her husband, if she had one, could be pressured to punish her for disrupting social order. Legal action was not just risky, it was dangerous. Marriage laws offered few protections. A woman became her husband's legal dependent upon marriage. She could not initiate divorce except in rare and extreme cases, such as proven impotence, abandonment, or heresy. Even then, she required approval from religious authorities and faced years of legal proceedings. Separation without formal approval was condemned. Adultery by a wife was a criminal offense. Adultery by a husband was a moral failing, but rarely punished. Custody laws heavily favored men. If a couple separated or a husband died, children were often placed under the authority of the father or his relatives. A widow's rights as a parent could be challenged. Remarriage brought complications. New husbands could refuse to raise another man's children or claim property left to them. Women could be forced to choose between financial survival and maternal connection. Laws regulating appearance and behavior were common. Sumptuary laws dictated what women could wear, depending on their class and marital status. Bright colors, jewels, or fine fabrics were reserved for the wealthy and the well-married. A woman dressed above her station could be fined or publicly shamed. Modesty was enforced not only by culture but by statute. Hair had to be covered. Garments had to be loose and ankle length. Breaches of dress code invited moral suspicion. Moral offenses were pursued aggressively. Accusations of fornication, gossip, witchcraft, or disobedience could be brought before local courts, often by neighbors or relatives. Punishments included flogging, fines, confinement, or forced public apologies. Women were made examples of. Their suffering served as warnings to others. Religious courts handled spiritual misconduct, neglecting Mass, improper fasting, or perceived impiety. These too were punished with severity. Inheritance laws prioritized male heirs. A woman might inherit a portion of land or wealth, but never the entirety. Her share was often absorbed into her husband's holdings. If a father died without sons, daughters were allowed to inherit only under strict limitations. Married daughters received less than sons. Unmarried daughters depended on guardians. Widows could claim dower rights, usually a third of the estate, but these were contested frequently and often denied. Property ownership was complicated and conditional. Women could not freely sell land, lend money, or sign business agreements without a male co-signer. Even in cases where they possessed land or tools, local lords and courts retained the right to interfere. Disputes with male neighbors were almost always settled in the man's favor. Legal documents, when they included women at all, used vague or diminished titles like the widow, the wife, or the maid. Justice, where it existed, was an illusion for most women. The structures that claimed to offer order instead preserved dominance. Men who broke laws were judged. Women who broke rules were condemned. The law was not a shield, it was a mirror, reflecting the values of a world where obedience mattered more than fairness and where women's voices were barely heard. Over time, women learned to expect little from the courts. They turned to informal networks, family, neighbors, clergy, but even those were unreliable. Rights where they existed were weak. Protections were conditional. Punishments were swift. And the message was clear: the law did not belong to them. War and conflict were regular features of medieval life. And while men fought on the front lines, women bore the hidden, unrecorded consequences. Battles destroyed villages, burned fields, and emptied homes of sons, fathers, and husbands. In their absence, women were left to tend farms, guard children, and rebuild from ashes. But their work was never seen as valorous. Survival was not glory, it was necessity. Invasions brought chaos. Soldiers, whether foreign or domestic, acted with impunity. Villages were looted, livestock stolen, homes set aflame. Women were especially vulnerable, considered spoils of war. Rape was frequent and unpunished. Women were taken as concubines, hostages, or slaves. Their injuries were invisible in battle records, their trauma unnamed. No compensation was offered, no justice was expected. Even when armies were not fighting, their mere presence caused fear. Military levies took resources from peasant communities. Women had to surrender grain, blankets, and labor to support troops. If they refused, they were punished. If they complied, they went hungry. Occupying soldiers stayed in homes without invitation. Women had to feed them, clean after them, and endure their behavior without recourse. Conscription took away male laborers, leaving women to do the work of two or three. They tilled soil, repaired tools, hunted, fished, and defended property when they could. There was no celebration for this labor, no titles, honors, or pensions. When men returned home, if they returned at all, women were expected to step back into their previous roles, without complaint or recognition. War also disrupted already fragile economies. Inflation raised prices while wages remained low. Crop failure from scorched land meant famine. Women scavenged for roots, bark, or dead animals. Mothers starved themselves so children might eat. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions. Starvation, infection, and exposure to the elements killed many more than swords did. These deaths were not tallied, they were forgotten. Noble women, too, faced war's reach. Their husbands were called to distant campaigns. In their absence, women were charged with overseeing estates, negotiating debts, and keeping order among servants and peasants. Yet they held no formal authority. Any decision they made could be overturned. If they failed to protect the estate, they were blamed. If they succeeded, their efforts were attributed to their absent husbands or male advisors. Sieges were particularly cruel. When cities or castles were surrounded, women suffered alongside everyone else, but with unique burdens. Food ran out quickly, water grew foul, illness became rampant, space grew cramped. Women gave birth on dirt floors under bombardment. Babies died within days. The weak perished, the rest endured in silence. If the city fell, slaughter often followed. Those not killed were enslaved or violated. Religion offered no respite. Clergy declared wars holy and encouraged women to support them with labor, obedience, and sacrifice. They were taught that their suffering was meaningful if offered to God. They lit candles, sang prayers, and waited. When news arrived that their sons or husbands had died, they wept privately, then returned to work. Grief did not excuse them from responsibility. Rebellions and civil wars added another layer of chaos. When peasants rose up against lords, women were caught in the middle. Armies retaliated brutally, burning entire villages in revenge. Women were punished whether or not they participated. If they aided rebels, they were traitors. If they remained passive, they were accused of disloyalty. There was no safe position. Loyalty was irrelevant to survival. During times of peace, the memory of war lingered. Abandoned wives became permanent widows. Orphans increased. Property was redistributed away from women and into the hands of the victorious. Conflicts between noble families reshaped laws, marriages, and inheritances. Women were moved like pawns to strengthen alliances. Peace treaties never mentioned them, but they often carried the consequences most deeply. For centuries, women's experiences of war remained unspoken. Chronicles recorded kings, battles, and banners, but not women's hunger, fear, or resilience. There were no ballads for the mothers who buried children, for the wives who rebuilt homes with burned hands, for the girls who hid from soldiers in barns or rivers. Their history was not preserved. Their bravery was unnoticed. The wars passed, the suffering remained. The next generation grew up with the same expectations, the same silence. No changes came. There were only new threats, new battles, and new women left to endure what men had caused but rarely remembered. Famine was another recurring force that shaped the lives of medieval women, pressing hardship into every corner of their existence. Crops failed due to floods, droughts, blights, or war. When they did, entire communities spiraled into desperation. Prices of grain soared, livestock died, wild plants were foraged until the fields were stripped bare. Women bore the brunt of this crisis, responsible as they were for managing food, rationing meals, and feeding families with whatever scraps remained. Preserving food was primitive and often unreliable. Salted meat could spoil, stored grain could be infested with weevils, bread baked with poor flour could sicken children. Mothers fed themselves last or not at all. Many women grew gaunt over long winters, their hands trembling from weakness as they stirred thin stews over smoky hearths. Hunger became a daily presence, never loud, never sudden, but slow and grinding, always there. Children cried through the night with empty stomachs. Infants stopped growing. Elderly women gave up their meals for younger ones and died quietly in corners. In times of deepest famine, people chewed bark, boiled shoe leather, or picked through refuse for moldy rinds or bones. Dogs and cats disappeared from villages. Stories circulated about more desperate measures, stories not written down, but passed in whispers and glances. The mental toll of famine was heavy. Women were blamed for what could not be controlled. Husbands questioned their housekeeping. Neighbors judged their cooking. Clergy preached that suffering came from sin and that women's weakness had brought ruin. Shame clung to mothers who couldn't feed their children. They wept alone, not from self-pity, but from helplessness, an emotion that could not be spoken aloud without reproach. In wealthier homes, famine looked different, but still weighed on women. Stores of grain and wine had to be guarded against theft. Servants had to be dismissed or beaten into silence. Kitchens were watched. Noble women were expected to manage scarcity with grace, to maintain appearances of abundance while people starved outside their gates. Guilt was not permitted. Pity was frowned upon. Their survival depended on separation, not solidarity. For women working in monasteries, famine meant attending to the dying. They administered water, prayed over skeletal bodies, and buried the dead in mass graves. Some fell ill themselves and were buried without markers. They were not remembered for mercy, but forgotten as background to the suffering. Names were not written on the crosses placed above the earth. They blended into history like the hungry they served. Markets collapsed, bartering replaced currency. Women tried to trade thread, eggs, or linen for handfuls of grain. Sometimes they sold their clothes, sometimes their dignity. Prostitution increased in desperate cities where food could be exchanged for favors. Disease spread easily through weakened bodies. Malnourished women could not fight infection. Plague and pestilence followed famine, and death arrived not as a stranger, but as something long expected. The church offered some relief in the form of alms, but it was insufficient and inconsistently delivered. Charity was seasonal, political, and moralized. A A woman seeking help might be interrogated about her chastity, her marriage, or her faith before receiving bread. Some chose not to ask at all. It was better to suffer in silence than to be shamed publicly in the name of Christian charity. Famine changed women's bodies permanently. Malnutrition during pregnancy affected unborn children. Bones grew soft, teeth decayed, eyesight faded. Many women never recovered fully. Those who survived a famine entered the next one already weakened. The cycle was endless. The memories were long, but the changes to society were few. Once the fields produced again, those in power returned to their feasts, while women returned to their kitchens with the same meager tools and expectations. The burden of remembering was left to them. They taught their daughters how to stretch dough thinner, how to dry herbs under leaking eaves, how to forage moss that wouldn't poison. These lessons were passed without ceremony, but with urgency. They did not expect change. They expected recurrence. That was the nature of their lives. Not progress, but repetition. The famine ended, the hunger paused, but the structures remained, as rigid as the stone walls of the church and as cold as the wind that had once swept across barren fields. Women did not ask why the suffering had occurred. They asked only when it would come again and how they might endure it next time. Illness and disease were constant companions in medieval life, shaping women's experiences from birth to death. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and remedies were a mix of superstition, herbal lore, and religious ritual. There were no hospitals as known today. Care was home-based, relying on family members, midwives, or local healers. Women were often both caregivers and patients, tasked with nursing the sick while enduring their own ailments in silence. Common illnesses included fevers, infections, respiratory problems, and digestive disorders. Tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza swept through communities with devastating effects. Women, weakened by childbirth and malnutrition, were especially susceptible. Healing was slow, uncertain, and often ineffective. Pain was endured because there was no alternative. Medicines could be poisonous or useless, and treatments were often harsher than the illnesses themselves. Childbirth was a particularly perilous event. Midwives attended births with simple tools, prayer, and experience passed down through generations. Complications like obstructed labor, hemorrhage, or infection were common causes of death. Maternal mortality rates were high. Infant mortality was even higher. Babies born weak or malformed were often left to die quietly, as survival was a matter of chance and strength. Mourning was private and immediate. There were no social rituals for lost children of common folk. Women also suffered from chronic conditions like arthritis, tooth decay, and gynecological problems. These conditions limited their ability to work and care for families, but rarely elicited sympathy. Pain was considered a normal part of life, especially for women. Religious teachings suggested that suffering was a test of faith or a punishment for sin. Complaints were discouraged. Women were expected to endure quietly, drawing strength from prayer and hope for the afterlife. Infectious diseases were feared but poorly understood. Plagues swept through towns and countryside, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. Women tended to the sick, prepared bodies for burial, and maintained households during outbreaks. These duties exposed them to contagion. Many died caring for family and neighbors. The Black Death of the 14th century was the most infamous, but smaller epidemics were frequent. Survivors bore scars, both physical and emotional, that lasted for years. Nutrition played a critical role in health. Food scarcity, poor diets, and hard labor left many women malnourished. This weakened immune systems and delayed recovery. Pregnant women with inadequate nutrition risked miscarriages or weak offspring. Children born to malnourished mothers were more likely to suffer developmental problems and early death. The cycle of poor health perpetuated itself through generations. Sanitation was primitive, waste disposal was minimal, and clean water was not guaranteed. Latrines, where they existed, were simple pits often shared by animals and humans. Drinking water sources were easily contaminated. This led to gastrointestinal diseases like dysentery and cholera. Women, responsible for fetching and managing water, had little control over its quality. Hygiene was limited by resources and knowledge. Healing practices combined the practical and the mystical. Women used herbs, poultices, and oils to treat wounds and illnesses. Midwives and healers often blended herbal remedies with prayers, charms, and spells. Church doctrine frowned upon magic, yet tolerated folk practices when no alternatives existed. Women's knowledge was passed orally, guarded carefully, and sometimes feared. Accusations of witchcraft could arise from healing activities, especially when outcomes were poor. Death was an ever-present reality. Women prepared the sick for passing, washed and dressed bodies, and arranged funerals. Mourning was expected but subdued, particularly among the lower classes. A woman's death left children vulnerable, households broken, and communities diminished. Life expectancy was low, often less than 40 years, and many women died in childbirth or from preventable diseases. Their deaths were noted only in passing in records or parish rolls. The medical system, such as it was, reflected societal attitudes toward women. Their health was often seen as secondary to their reproductive function and service to others. Treatment was minimal and largely palliative. Women's voices about their own bodies were unheard. Their pain was invisible. Medical texts were written by men for men. Women who sought remedies outside accepted boundaries risked suspicion and punishment. Despite these hardships, women continued to care for their families and communities. They shared knowledge, supported one another, and persevered through illness and loss. Their endurance was quiet, unnoticed, and uncelebrated. The diseases of the time shaped not just bodies, but entire ways of life, reinforcing the harsh realities of medieval womanhood. Childbirth, a central and inevitable event in medieval women's lives, was marked by constant danger and suffering. Pregnancy itself was fraught with risk. Without prenatal care or medical knowledge, complications were common and often fatal. The growing child, the mother's health, and the many unknowns of gestation created a fragile balance, easily disrupted by malnutrition, disease, or exhaustion. Labor was a test of endurance. Midwives, often experienced older women in the community, assisted using simple tools, herbs, and prayers. There were no surgical interventions or pain relief. Birth could take hours, days even, with no guarantee of a healthy mother or child. Many women died from bleeding, infection, or exhaustion during or shortly after childbirth. Infant mortality was high. Stillborn children or those who died within days were common tragedies that went largely unrecorded. Postpartum care was minimal. Women were expected to recover quickly and return to their daily work. Rest was a luxury few could afford. Household duties, childcare, and farm labor waited. Breastfeeding was the norm, often lasting several years, limiting women's ability to conceive again immediately, but also taxing their bodies. Wet nurses were a luxury for the wealthy. For most, breastfeeding was both nourishment and a source of pain and exhaustion. Pregnancy and childbirth shaped women's roles in society. Fertility was prized, but each birth also risked a mother's life. Families relied on women to bear many children to ensure survival of heirs, but this came at great cost. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant death were devastating emotionally and physically. Widows with many children faced uncertain futures, often dependent on charity or relatives. The rituals surrounding birth and death were tightly controlled by social and religious customs. Baptisms were urgent, as infant death was frequent and believed to affect the soul's fate. Midwives often participated in prayers and blessings, serving both practical and spiritual roles. The loss of a child was mourned quietly, without public displays, especially among peasants. Noble families had elaborate ceremonies, but these were exceptions. Pregnancy also imposed social restrictions. Women were expected to behave cautiously, avoid certain foods or activities, and adhere to modesty. Superstitions about evil spirits or curses were common. A pregnant woman might be isolated or subjected to rituals intended to protect her and her unborn child. Failure to comply with customs could bring suspicion or blame for misfortune. Repeated pregnancies weakened women's bodies. Pelvic deformities, chronic pain, and exhaustion were common after multiple births. These conditions limited mobility and lifespan. Women rarely lived long enough to enjoy old age. Instead, their lives were shaped by cycles of conception, birth, nursing, and loss. The physical toll was immense, often invisible in historical records. Infertility or inability to produce a male heir carried social stigma, Women were blamed for childlessness or the birth of daughters regardless of actual causes. Pressure from husbands, families, and communities could be intense. In some cases, women faced neglect, abuse, or abandonment. Remarriage or polygamy was sometimes forced upon husbands seeking heirs. A woman's value was tied to her reproductive success. Despite the dangers, childbirth was central to women's identities. It connected them to family, community, and faith. Mothers passed on traditions, prayers, and knowledge to daughters. The shared experience created bonds of solidarity, even in silence. These connections sustained women through the brutal realities of medieval life. Clothing and appearance in medieval society were tightly regulated and laden with meaning, especially for women. What a woman wore signified her status, virtue, and obedience. The laws and customs governing dress reflected broader social hierarchies and moral expectations. A woman's attire was not simply personal choice. It was a public statement of her place and character. Most women wore garments made from wool or linen. Wool was common and warm but rough. Linen was lighter but more expensive. Clothing was homemade, spun, and woven by hand, often by the women themselves. The process was time-consuming and labor-intensive. Fabric was dyed using natural substances, plants, minerals, insects, yielding colors that faded quickly and were usually muted. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. These laws forbade lower-class women from wearing certain colors, fabrics, or decorations. For example, bright silk or velvet was reserved for nobility. Only wealthy women could afford such luxuries, which were imported and costly. The lower classes made do with coarse, undyed cloth, patched garments, or cast-offs. Wearing forbidden fabrics could lead to fines or public shaming. Modesty was paramount. Women's clothing was designed to cover the body from neck to ankle. Sleeves were long, necklines high. Hair was always covered by veils, wimples, or simple scarves to signify chastity and submission. Uncovered hair was a sign of impropriety or unmarried status. Jewelry was limited, and ostentatious displays were discouraged for all but the highest ranks. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. These laws forbade lower-class women from wearing certain colors, fabrics, or decorations. For example, bright silk or velvet was reserved for nobility. Only wealthy women could afford such luxuries, which were imported and costly. The lower classes made do with coarse, undyed cloth, patched garments, or cast-offs. Wearing forbidden fabrics could lead to fines or public shaming. Modesty was paramount. Women's clothing was designed to cover the body from neck to ankle. Sleeves were long, necklines high. Hair was always covered by veils, wimples, or simple scarves to signify chastity and submission. Uncovered hair was a sign of impropriety or unmarried status. Jewelry was limited and ostentatious displays were discouraged for all but the highest ranks. Undergarments were minimal. Linen shifts served as underdresses, often the only layer next to the skin. Layers were added for warmth or protection, but were rarely decorative. Shoes were basic and often homemade from leather, worn until they were threadbare. Wealthier women had more comfortable and colorful footwear, but most wore practical, simple shoes. Clothing had practical functions too. Aprons protected dresses during work. Cloaks shielded from rain and cold. Hoods were worn outdoors for warmth and privacy. However, practicality was always balanced against expectations of modesty and class. A working woman could not dress like a noble, but she could not appear too shabby either. Appearance was a constant negotiation. Clothing marked life stages and occasions. Girls wore simpler clothes than married women. Widows adopted darker or plainer garments as a sign of mourning. Special garments were worn for church, festivals, and weddings, though these occasions were rare for peasants. Costumes for religious pageants or plays reflected social roles and reinforced community values. Clothes also had symbolic meaning. Bright colors were associated with vitality and status, dark colors with piety and humility. Certain colors or styles could identify political allegiances or religious affiliations. Fashion was not neutral, but part of the social fabric that controlled women's bodies and movements. Maintaining clothing was a daily chore. Washing was done by hand with ash or soapwort, often in cold water. Repairs were constant. Patching was necessary to extend the life of garments. Sewing required skill and patience. Clothes were handed down within families. Textile and garment production consumed hours of women's labor, often without recognition. Pressure to maintain appearances despite poverty was stressful. A woman judged too plainly dressed risked gossip, suspicion, or exclusion. Those who dressed too finely risked accusations of vanity or dishonesty. Balancing expectations required vigilance and compromise. Clothing was not just fabric, but a language that women had to master to survive socially. For noble women, fashion was a display of power and wealth, but also a form of constraint. Elaborate gowns, heavy fabrics, and complex fastenings restricted movement and required servants to assist dressing. Hairstyles and headdresses were carefully arranged to convey status. Despite luxury, these fashions limited freedom and emphasized social hierarchy. Across all classes, clothing was intertwined with identity, morality, and survival. Women's bodies were dressed not only to protect or adorn, but to signal obedience and conformity. Deviation was dangerous. Clothing reinforced the harsh realities of medieval womanhood: visible, regulated, and confined. Social expectations and the roles assigned to women in medieval society created a rigid framework that dictated behavior, opportunity, and survival. From childhood, girls were prepared for a life defined by obedience, labor, and subservience. The education they received was limited, often informal, and focused almost entirely on domestic skills and piety. Intellectual pursuits, political involvement, or personal ambition were discouraged or outright forbidden. Girls learned to spin, weave, cook, sew, and care for children. They watched their mothers and aunts, absorbing lessons in silence and imitation. Religious instruction emphasized humility, chastity, and obedience as virtues. The concept of womanhood was inseparable from suffering and sacrifice. Personal desires or dissent were suppressed. Girls were told their greatest value was in serving husbands, bearing children, and maintaining households. Marriage was the central institution shaping women's lives. Arranged marriages were common, negotiated by families for social or economic advantage. Love was not a consideration. Girls were often married in their early teens. Consent was assumed, not sought. The wedding was less a celebration of affection and more a transfer of control from father to husband. After marriage, a woman's identity shifted entirely to her role as wife and mother. Obedience to husbands was expected without question. Husbands had legal authority over their wives. Women were to respect, obey, and serve. Disobedience was punished socially and sometimes legally. A wife's duty included household management, child rearing, and sexual availability. Husbands' responsibilities were minimal by comparison. They could neglect, abuse, or abandon wives with few consequences. Widowhood brought some autonomy, but also precariousness. Widows could manage property or businesses temporarily, but they faced pressure to remarry. Without a husband's protection, a woman's social status and economic security were vulnerable. Older widows were often marginalized or accused of witchcraft. Their independence was tolerated only if it did not challenge male authority. Social life for women was limited. Gatherings, markets, and festivals provided some interaction, but these were circumscribed by decorum and supervision. Public speaking or leadership roles were rare. Gossip and reputation policing enforced conformity. Women who challenged norms risked ostracism or punishment. Ambition was dangerous. Sexuality was tightly controlled. Virginity before marriage was prized. Chastity after was demanded. Women's bodies were considered sources of temptation and sin. Any deviation from prescribed norms was harshly judged. Accusations of promiscuity could ruin lives. Sexual violence was common, but rarely addressed. Women had little legal recourse and were often blamed for assaults. Religion reinforced these roles. Biblical stories, sermons, and teachings emphasized women's submission and sinfulness. Saints and martyrs were often female, but praised for silence and suffering, not power or agency. Spiritual life for women was centered on obedience to God and earthly fathers or husbands. Rebellion was considered sinful and dangerous. Despite these harsh conditions, women found ways to form communities and support one another. Female networks in households, churches, and markets created spaces for shared knowledge and mutual aid. Informal mentoring, shared labor, and collective prayer offered moments of relief. These bonds were vital for survival in a world that offered little protection or recognition. The weight of expectations shaped every moment of a woman's day, from how she dressed, spoke, worked, and moved, to how she bore pain, loss, and fear. Social norms were a constant presence. These norms were internalized and passed down, becoming part of identity and survival strategy. Resistance was rare and often hidden. Most women adapted to survive. The medieval social order was not static but deeply entrenched. It shaped generations of women to accept hardship as natural and inevitable. Change was slow or non-existent. Women were taught to endure, obey, and sacrifice, and they did. The system ensured their subjugation was self-reinforcing and perpetual. Death in the medieval period was a constant looming presence, shaping the lives and consciousness of all, especially women. Life expectancy was low, and mortality rates were high from infancy through childbirth, illness, and accidents. For women, death was not a distant event, but an ever-present reality that framed their existence with both fear and resignation. Funerals and mourning rituals reflected social status, but offered little comfort to those left behind. Most women died quietly, without ceremony, their passing noted only in parish records or oral memory. Burial sites were often communal and unmarked for the poor. Wealthier women might be interred with modest gravestones or in consecrated ground near churches, but even then, their names often faded over time. The experience of losing children was common and devastating. Infant mortality was tragically high due to disease, malnutrition, and poor hygiene. Mothers who buried children learned to suppress grief quickly, for survival demanded continued care for remaining family members. There were no formal support systems. Mourning was a private act, hidden beneath daily toil and social expectations. Widowhood was both a loss and a new burden. Women who outlived husbands faced social uncertainty and economic vulnerability. Without male protection, widows struggled to maintain homes and livelihoods. Remarriage was often necessary but fraught with risk. Widows were subject to suspicion and marginalization, their independence viewed as a threat to social order. Death from childbirth was a leading cause of mortality for women. The dangers of pregnancy, labor, and postpartum complications claimed many lives. The absence of medical knowledge and sterile conditions made each birth a gamble. Midwives offered care but could not prevent all tragedies. A woman's life was often shortened by the very act expected to fulfill her social role. The mental toll of constant death was profound but unspoken. Grief, anxiety, and fear were woven into daily life. Women learned to endure sorrow silently, as expressing such feelings openly was discouraged. Religious teachings framed death as a passage to eternal life, providing some solace but also reinforcing acceptance of suffering. Communities adapted to frequent deaths with rituals of remembrance and collective mourning, though these were uneven and often dictated by class. Mass graves during plagues or famines showed the scale of loss but erased individual identities. The living carried memories, stories, and prayers, preserving traces of those who had passed. Death also shaped family structures. Early mortality created complex kinship networks as children lost parents and were raised by relatives or fostered out. Inheritance and property passed quickly through generations, often leaving women with little security. The social fabric was fragile, held together by tenuous ties and shared vulnerability. Despite the omnipresence of death, life continued. Women bore children, managed households, worked fields, and tended the sick. Their resilience was the foundation of medieval society, though it remained invisible in histories and chronicles. The acceptance of death as natural did not lessen its impact, but became part of a harsh reality they endured. The harshness of death, like every other aspect of medieval life for women, was embedded in a system that offered little choice or comfort. Survival was a daily achievement, and endurance a form of strength. The cycle of birth, life, suffering, and death repeated endlessly, shaping generations and defining the contours of women's existence. In the end, the story of medieval women is one of unrelenting hardship, shaped by forces beyond their control: social, economic, religious, and biological. Their lives were marked by toil, pain, and limited agency, yet they persisted. Their suffering was immense, their voices silenced, and their stories often lost. This was the brutal reality of medieval womanhood,